Hey everyone, it's Patrick Scott, and today I wanted to talk to you about my DevOps story and my journey into DevOps Bliss. It started quite a few years back. I've been programming for a really long time, and I guess the first real taste of DevOps I had, or the lack of DevOps rather, was in 2010 when I'd started my first job out of college. I was a UX engineer, so I was building interfaces. I wasn't really responsible for deploying things or running them in production. However, at that company, all of the engineers, once you'd been there long enough, you got added to a rotation, something called a shiny phone. And the shiny phone was this like really old flip phone. It was made with this like glass-like shiny material, so you could, it was like a reflection. So, hence the clever name, the shiny phone, because it was shiny. And the shiny phone was wired up to receive alerts. So if something went wrong in the system, or a website that was important was no longer available because the system could not get access to it, then it would send a text message to the shiny phone. So whoever had the shiny phone was responsible for getting that text message and resolving the issue. And there was a rotation because it kind of sucked, So everyone would get it for a week at a time. So after several months of working at my UX engineering job and learned, I was a full stack developer because it was 2010 and that was really the only type of developer there was. I was doing .NET on the back end and a lot of JavaScript, jQuery, CSS on the front end. And so I got the shiny phone, and I remember it was November. It was a pretty cold night when I was sleeping, and I woke up to this like flashing light and like these beeps and beep, 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 because the phone was just getting like 20 different text messages about how things weren't working. There was some sort of like pretty critical failure, and I was awoken into the middle of the night, and it was my turn to deal with it. And I remember just being like pretty nervous, because there was two technical co-founders for the company that I respected them both a lot. This guy named Kevin and this guy named Sergey. They were both really, really bright, smart guys. And I wanted to impress them, I wanted them to feel like that they made the right choice in hiring me and I could handle the issues. And even though it wasn't something that I was like super well trained on or had done a ton of, they had like kind of a set of steps that you could follow that would work in most instances. So I remember waking up to this beeps and this lights and crawling out of bed and flashing on the lights and like blinding myself as like the lights turned on. And I had to go on my computer, so I remember walking over across I remember the floor was really cold. It was a cold night, like the air was chilly. I threw on a sweater because I just got out of bed, and in the corner of my room I had this little like $20 piece of crap desk that I got when I was in college, and a super uncomfortable like office chair. So I sat down and opened up my laptop, and I had a desktop back at the office, so I remote desktoped into my desktop at the office that had access to the servers and stuff. And I was like, okay, I got this. So what's the first step now that I'm in? I opened up the phone, and it gave me an IP address to visit. So I typed in the IP address and hit enter and waited and waited and waited, and then I was like, okay, this is not loading, like there's something wrong, like the server is not responding. So I was kind of like, oh shit, that's the first step. I can't even I can't even get into the machine to see what's wrong. So, something must be pretty wrong. So I opened up the flip phone and I was scrolling through. I remember it had this like really bright blue background and this really pixelated looking text. So I scrolled down and I found Sergey in the contacts. It was this Russian SQL wizard. He had a really thick, heavy Russian accent. So I had to call him at like 3 a.m. and be like, hey, Sergey, there's something's wrong with the server. I tried to log into the IP address it gave and it didn't work, so like nothing's accessible. And he was like, yes, okay. And then he hung up. And I was just like, oh, okay, I guess I'm done. So I went back to bed and I was a little disheartened because I wasn't able to solve the issue, but at least I was able to screen it from false alarms. And I woke up Sergey when I had to, which was kind of really the point of the junior people having the phone screen to screen these problems. Didn't need to wake up the CTO or the senior engineers like for every single blip. A lot of times it was a pretty easy fix and they had it documented, so you could just go through it. But in this case it wasn't, so I woke up Sergey and went back to bed. That was really my first taste of like DevOps, or the lack of DevOps, really. I hated it. I hated the shiny phone. I never wanted to do it again. It was really stressful, and like you wake up and like alarms are going off. It's just like panic, So it's not a fun thing to wake up to. So a few years passed before I kind of started caring about it again. I was working at a UX at a finance company as a UX engineer again, more a full stack developer, but this time with more Node. And even at that place, we had a DevOps team, so I didn't really have to care about how the applications I made ran, because there were DevOps people that I could give my code to, and they would like set it up and make sure that it was running in production. So a few years passed and I was really getting the itch to start my own company, to be entrepreneurial, to be a CTO. And so I did. I started a company called Plusmore, and I was the CTO. And the first 2 months were, super smooth, because it was just ideation and development and making MVPs and prototypes. But eventually it got to the point where I needed to deploy it all and run it all online. And I wasn't great at this stuff. A lot of times it had been done for me in my career up until that point. And so I did what most engineers do who don't know DevOps, and I turned to a PaaS provider like Heroku or Modulus, Nodejitsu at the time. My buddy Charlie made that one, which is gone now. They were acquired by GoDaddy. Anyway, so I started deploying all my services with the PaaS provider. And that was good to start, but then eventually, okay, just the production environment isn't enough. We need a staging environment as well. And also, I was making microservices. And that means I had 7 or 8 or 9 different services to deploy, times 2 environments, which means I was deploying 18 services instead of 9 with every time I had to do a release. And there's these clunky UIs that you have to enter the environment variables and stuff. So it became pretty unpleasant pretty quickly. And I was like, okay, I need to get better at this. What is the next step? And luckily for me, I was able to put off that next step again because I was using a development platform called Meteor. And they released a DevOps service called Galaxy. So all I had to do was give them my Meteor code and they would handle running it. And they had a highly available setup, and it handled failovers and all this really cool stuff that I didn't know how to engineer myself. And that was great because, we were a startup, and if engineers always want to figure out how do I solve everything. Sometimes the better question is who, and that answer, the who, was Galaxy. They had their own way to do things, and it worked for me. The problem was that it was a proprietary system, so if you weren't using Meteor, you couldn't really take advantage of it. And things in the development world change really quickly. So Meteor went out of style. And then I had all these node services, and I couldn't deploy them to Galaxy. So then I had a mix of stuff on Galaxy that were Meteor, and I had a mix of just pure node stuff that was on Modulus. And then I had a database that I needed, and I set that up on like a Mongo Lab, like database as a service. And I connected them all together, which isn't optimal by any way, because they're doing all this communication over the internet instead of internal private networks. So you end up with this like a much higher latency, and also you need to coordinate all these different external systems to talk to each other, and it gets pretty cumbersome. So I was like, okay, this isn't working anymore. Like, this has reached to the point where I can no longer, it's not scalable. Like, I can't keep doing this like for every release. It's too cumbersome and error prone and just like this huge headache. So I was like, I need to figure out the next way. Like, what's the next level up from here? And I seemed at the time, like pretty much everything was on AWS. And I was like, okay, I guess it's time for me to learn AWS. So I signed up for a certification class with like some cloud guru thing. And I just, part of it bothered me because I knew it was like locking me into AWS specifically. And, some people had, like, Microsoft Cloud was coming out, and that was getting pretty good, and Google had their own cloud as well. And all of the stuff I was learning was like really AWS specific, which, some of it was helpful, but a lot of it wasn't really for my use case. And I was like, man, I just really want to focus on development. Like, I don't want to learn all of AWS. Like, I just want that to be taken care of for me, and I don't want to worry about it. I want that to be automated and easy, so I can just code and give my code to something and it runs it, just like Galaxy, because that was great. So how do I build Galaxy for myself? AWS certifications, right? So I just wasn't satisfied, so I kept digging in, and there was a new technology at the time that was getting really popular, and that was called containerization, and something called Docker. And it seemed to promise solutions to all these things that I was having troubles with, because the way it worked was similar to Galaxy, where you just give it your Meteor code and it runs it. They had these thing called orchestrators, and you just gave them your container and it ran it. So dealing with like a Java application versus a Node versus Go versus whatever else, like all of that didn't matter. All that mattered was you put your thing into a container, and then you had these systems that worked with containers. It didn't work with nodes specifically. So it was kind of this abstraction that allowed you to deploy things really easily, so long as you could figure out how to put them into a container. Containers are kind of like shipping containers. Like if you were a furniture store and you wanted to ship like a couch to Europe from America, just throwing the couch on the boat probably wouldn't work really well. Or picking it up with the crane, you'd probably put the crane right through it and like tear a big hole in it. So instead what you do is you put the couch and whatever else you're shipping in containers, and then cranes come and they lift up this container in like a uniform way, and they place it all into like rows that are really neatly organized and optimized to fit all these spaces. But the crane, it doesn't matter what's inside. It doesn't matter if it's a couch or a TV or like dog food or whatever else, right? Like, it doesn't matter. It just deals with containers. So Docker is the same way. You don't need to know how to deploy a node application. You need to know how to deploy a container. So that was the beginning of a pretty long journey for me. And containerization was that first super critical piece. So if you're at the point where you're like, I need to learn AWS, I would think about that. I would question that, because I don't think that you do. I think that AWS certifications are kind of useless, because what you get with an orchestrator like Kubernetes is basically a mini AWS, and you can run it anywhere. So instead of focusing on AWS certifications, the goal is to learn containerization. And once you have mastered containerization, you have access to orchestrators. So all you need to do is figure out how to get your code into a container, and then you can give it to an orchestrator, which will handle a lot of the difficult parts for you. There's still the issue of how do I run an orchestrator, but that's pretty easy as well. And I will talk about that more next time. Thanks for tuning in today. I would love to continue to teach more about what it takes to be successful as a technical co-founder. So there's quite a few topics that go into that. There's, if you build it, they will come. No, they won't. So there's marketing, and then there's obviously like the technical pieces, like how do you architect a system that scales. So I write a ton on Medium. Go follow me on Medium. It's medium.com/@PatrickLeet. That's PatrickLeet. It's the same name on GitHub. And you can find me on Twitter at @Pat_Scott. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.